Imagine that every time you sat down to eat, the first thing you did was say a quiet thank you. Tonight, we'll learn that in Bible times, food was a precious gift from God. Every fig, every piece of cheese, and every sip of water was a reason to be grateful. A meal was a time to remember that you were being cared for. If this story brings you some peace, you can subscribe for more. It makes the world feel a little smaller and friendlier to know who is out there listening with me. Chapter 1. David's Morning. The first light of dawn crept over the hills of Nazareth, a pale gold finger reaching through the single window of the small stone house to touch the face of the sleeping boy. David stirred, the familiar sounds of the waking village pulling him from his dreams, the distant crow of a rooster, the soft bleating of a goat, the gentle rustle of his mother moving about in the main room. He opened his eyes, blinking away the remnants of sleep, and the day began not with a rush, but with a slow, deliberate unfolding, as steady and ancient as the land itself. He rose from his simple mat, the cool earthen floor, a familiar sensation beneath his bare feet. His mother, Sarah, was already at the hearth, her form silhouetted against the low fire she was coaxing to life. She moved with a quiet grace, her hands performing the morning rituals that had greeted countless sunrises. Without a word, David took the clay water jar from its place near the door, its familiar weight a comfort in his small hands. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the sky a canvas of soft lavender, and rose above the clustered rooftops of the village. The path to the well was well worn, a testament to the generations of feet that had trod it. The chill of the stone well seeped into his palms as he lowered the bucket, the rope rough and familiar. He hauled it up, the water sloshing heavily, a liquid silver in the growing light. The journey back was slower, the full jar requiring all his concentration, each careful step a small act of contribution. Returning, he placed the water beside his mother, receiving a soft smile that warmed him more than the burgeoning fire. Next, Sarah handed him a small woven basket. He went to the corner where the clay jars of provisions were stored, scooping glossy black olives from their brine. Their sharp, salty scent filled the air as they tumbled into the basket, a promise of the simple meal to come. Back at the low table, his mother was already shaping the dough for the flatbread, her fingers pressing and turning the mixture of flour and water with a practiced rhythm. When the simple meal was assembled, the round of flatbread, the bowl of olives, a cup of water, they did not eat immediately. Instead, they sat together on the floor mats, and a profound silence fell over them, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with presence. Sarah bowed her head, and David followed, closing his eyes. She began to speak, her voice a low, melodic whisper that seemed to hold the very essence of the morning. She blessed God, the provider of the grain and the olive, the sun and the rain, the breath in their lungs. David listened, the words weaving a tapestry of gratitude that settled deep within him. He felt the truth of them, that this food was not merely sustenance, but a gift, a tangible sign of a covenant that stretched back through time. Then they broke the bread. The sound of the crust cracking was sharp in the quiet room. The inside was soft and warm, steam rising to carry its earthy scent. He ate slowly, the taste of the humble flatbread and the briny olive feeling like a feast. The warmth in his chest was more than the heat of the food. It was the warmth of his mother's approving glance, the warmth of the shared silence, the warmth of a bond forged in these simple, sacred acts. In that quiet Nazareth morning, David learned his first and most important lesson, that every meal, no matter how small, was a story that began not with hunger, but with gratitude. Chapter 2. Learning to grind grain. The stone mill stood in the corner of their home like a silent, patient beast, its two heavy circular stones waiting for the day's work to begin. After the morning meal, David's father, Jacob, placed a hand on the cool, rough surface of the upper stone, his calloused fingers tracing the groove where a wooden handle would soon be fitted. He beckoned David closer, his eyes holding the steady light of a man about to pass on knowledge as old as their people. Jacob scooped a handful of golden wheat berries from a woven basket, letting them trickle through his fingers into the small hole at the center of the top stone. They made a soft, rattling whisper as they disappeared into the dark opening. He then fitted the long, smooth handle into its slot and looked at David, a silent invitation in his gaze. The boy stepped forward, his small hands wrapping around the worn wood. He pushed, putting his whole weight into it, but the stone refused to budge. It was far heavier, far more stubborn than he had imagined. A flush of frustration warmed his cheeks. His father's large, steady hands then covered his own, not to take over, but to guide. Together, they began to move the handle in a slow, grinding circle. The stones groaned to life, a deep, grating rumble that vibrated up through David's arms and into his very bones. It was a sound of immense, patient labor. After a few revolutions, Jacob released his hands, and David was left to continue alone. His arms burned almost immediately, the repetitive motion demanding muscles he seldom used. The circle he made was wobbly and uneven, and he could feel the stones protest, their grind becoming jerky and inefficient. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. He glanced at his father, expecting to see impatience, but found only calm observation. Jacob pointed to the way David was standing, his feet too close together, his body fighting the motion instead of flowing with it. David adjusted his stance, planting his feet wider, and leaned into the push, using his body's momentum. Slowly, the grinding became smoother, the rumble more consistent. His breath fell into rhythm with the circling stone, and the burning in his arms settled into a steady, manageable ache. He watched, mesmerized, as a fine, pale powder began to dust the rim of the lower stone and collect in the shallow trough surrounding it. As David worked, his father spoke in a low, reverent tone about the wheat itself, how it was a gift from God, planted in faith and brought forth by sun and rain. He described the miracle of the tiny, hard berry being transformed through this patient, crushing labor into the soft, life-giving powder that would become their bread. The grinding was not a punishment, he explained, but a partnership with the creation God had provided. It was a sacred transformation, turning the raw gift of the field into a substance that would sustain a family. When Jacob finally signaled for him to stop, David's arms felt heavy and limp, but his heart felt light. He looked at the small pile of fresh, fragrant flour he had produced, a soft beige mound that smelled of dust and sunshine. His father scooped some into his palm, letting it sift through his fingers back into the trough, a silent gesture of approval. A profound sense of accomplishment swelled within David's chest, warm and solid. This was not like fetching water or gathering olives. This was the very foundation of their meals, the essence of the bread he broke each day. He had participated in that creation. He had taken the hard gift of the earth and with his own effort had begun the process of turning it into sustenance. For the first time, he felt not like a child who merely received, but like a contributor to the life of his family, and in that small dusty pile of flour he tasted the profound pride of honest work. Chapter 3. The first loaf. The flour David had ground with such effort now lay in a smooth, pale mound in the center of the wide, shallow mixing bowl. His mother, Sarah, added a pinch of salt and a trickle of water from the jar he had fetched at dawn, her hands beginning the alchemy that would turn dust into sustenance. David watched, utterly captivated, as her fingers stirred and gathered, the separate elements surrendering to become one cohesive mass. She kneaded the dough with a rhythm that was both strong and gentle, pressing, folding, and turning it until it was smooth and elastic, a living thing beneath her touch. She then covered it with a clean cloth and set it aside to rest, a patient waiting for transformation. The heart of their home, the clay oven, was already breathing heat into the room. Sarah had built a fire inside its domed chamber hours before, feeding it until the stones glowed with a fierce orange light. Now the flames had died down to embers, and she swept them aside, exposing the flat, hot, baking stone that formed the oven's floor. A wave of dry, intense heat washed over David as he knelt nearby, making him blink. This was the final trial, the moment where his contribution would be tested by fire. His mother handed him a small portion of the risen dough. It felt soft and warm, slightly alive in his palms. He mimicked her movements, patting and stretching it carefully, trying to form a perfect, thin circle. His own attempt was lopsided, thicker on one edge, but Sarah did not correct him. She simply nodded, her expression one of quiet encouragement. He watched as she took her perfectly round piece and with a practiced flip of her wrist, slapped it onto the searing surface of the baking stone. It landed with a soft, definitive hiss. Then it was his turn. He hesitated for a second, feeling the intense radiance of the heat on his face. Taking a breath, he copied her motion, laying his misshapen piece of dough onto the stone beside hers. The immediate sizzle was a sound of pure potential. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, tiny bubbles began to form on the surface of the bread. They grew, rising like miniature landscapes, the pale dough beginning to blush a soft gold around the edges. David held his breath, his eyes fixed on his loaf. A larger bubble swelled in its center, rising into a proud, rounded dome before his very eyes. The entire surface of the bread was now a tapestry of golden brown spots, and the air filled with a rich, nutty, profoundly comforting aroma that was the very soul of their home. Sarah used a long, flat wooden paddle to deftly flip the breads, revealing undersides that were perfectly evenly browned. A few moments more, and she slid them off the stone and onto a woven platter. David's loaf sat beside his mother's, a testament to his effort. It was not as symmetrical, its surface a more chaotic map of blisters and bubbles, but it was his. When the rest of the family gathered for the midday meal, Jacob's eyes fell upon the 2 loaves. He pointed to David's, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He broke a piece from it, the crust crackling loudly in the quiet room. He ate it slowly, his gaze thoughtful, and then he placed a hand on David's shoulder, the weight of it full of unspoken pride. Sarah and David's younger sister also took pieces, their enjoyment evident in their quiet smiles. They ate the simple bread with olives and a few dried figs, but the focus of the meal was the flatbread, warm from the fire and imbued with a significance that went far beyond taste. As David chewed his own creation, the slightly dense, wonderfully chewy texture, a direct result of his own grinding and shaping, he looked around at his family. He saw the satisfaction on their faces, the simple pleasure of a shared meal, the morning's ache in his arms, the frustration at the heavy millstone, the intense heat of the oven, all of it melted away, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. The hard work of his hands had not just filled their stomachs, it had become a gift, a silent language of love and contribution. In that moment, David understood that the true nourishment was not in the eating alone, but in the sharing. The labor was worthwhile because its final, perfect purpose was to be broken and given to others. Chapter 4. A Visit from Cousins. The afternoon sun hung warm and golden over Nazareth when the sound of distant, cheerful voices and the crunch of footsteps on the dry path announced the arrival of visitors. David, who had been practicing his grinding technique in the shade of the doorway, looked up to see a cloud of dust approaching, resolving into the familiar figures of his aunt, uncle, and two boisterous cousins from a nearby village. His heart gave a little leap of anticipation. Visits were rare and precious events, breaks in the steady rhythm of daily life that promised stories, laughter, and a shared meal. His mother, Sarah, emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. The greetings were a flurry of warm embraces and patted shoulders, the air filling with the happy noise of reunited family. David's cousins, Reuben and little Miriam, immediately pulled him into their orbit, their eyes bright with the excitement of the journey and the prospect of adventure. The small house, usually a place of quiet industry, suddenly felt larger, its walls expanding to hold the burgeoning joy. Sarah and David moved with a new, purposeful energy. The simple evening meal they had planned was no longer enough. From the cool, dark storage jars came their best provisions, a bowl of plump, honeyed figs saved for a special occasion, a larger portion of the savory bean stew simmering over the fire, and the last of the pressed olive oil, golden and fragrant. David watched his mother carefully select the finest, most perfectly round flatbreads from the stack, the ones with the most even color and the softest texture. She arranged them on the platter not as mere sustenance, but as an offering of honor. As David helped carry the food to the low table, his mother gently took the platter of figs from him. She pointed to the ones that were the most succulent, their skins split slightly to reveal the amber sweetness within, and then to their guests. With a soft word, she explained that the choicest portions, the first and best of what they had, were always for those who crossed their threshold. It was a sacred rule of hospitality, a way of showing that guests were a blessing, a tangible extension of God's favor. David absorbed this lesson not as a command, but as a natural law, as fundamental as gratitude itself. He watched as his father, Jacob, poured the water for their guests to wash their feet, a gesture of humble service that completed the welcome. The meal began, and the room filled with a different kind of warmth. The stew, enriched with the good oil, tasted richer. The bread, broken and passed from hand to hand, felt lighter. But it was the laughter that truly fed them. Reuben, the older cousin, recounted a tale of a runaway goat that had led him on a frantic chase through the village, his animated telling punctuated by wild gestures that made little Miriam giggle uncontrollably. Jacob shared a story from his own youth, a fishing mishap on the Sea of Galilee that had ended with him soaked and empty-handed, his wry smile inviting everyone into the memory. David sat among them, his own simple bread tasting like a feast, his heart swelling with a sense of belonging that was as solid and comforting as the stone walls of his home. He watched the faces around the table, illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp. His father's weathered features relaxed in a smile, his mother's eyes shining with contentment, his cousins' faces alight with joy. The stories wove a tapestry that connected them all, strengthening the invisible threads of kinship that stretched across the hills and villages. The food on the table was the anchor of this fellowship, the simple act of sharing a meal transforming from a daily routine into a celebration of family. As the last of the figs were eaten and the final stories were told, David felt a deep, quiet happiness settle over him. He understood now that hospitality was more than just offering food. It was about offering a piece of one's heart, and in return, the family itself grew stronger, its bonds fortified by beans, figs, bread, and the timeless currency of shared laughter. Chapter 5. The Sabbath Preparation. The sun began its slow, majestic descent behind the hills of Nazareth, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. A palpable shift settled over the village, a collective intake of breath as the ordinary rhythms of the week yielded to the approaching holiness of the Sabbath. Inside David's home, the usual quiet industry transformed into a flurry of purposeful activity, each task imbued with a sense of sacred anticipation. The approaching sunset was not an end, but a glorious beginning, and every member of the family moved with a shared intention to welcome it properly. Sarah, her movements both efficient and reverent, directed the final cleaning of their small stone house. David took a bundle of dried reeds and swept the earthen floor with long, sure strokes, raising tiny clouds of dust that danced in the slanted evening light. Every surface was wiped clean, every tool put in its place. The simple act of sweeping felt different today. It was not just about removing dirt, but about preparing a space, creating a vessel worthy of containing the peace of the holy day. The air itself seemed to grow stiller, waiting. Meanwhile, the heart of the home, the cooking area, was a hub of fragrant creation. Sarah had prepared 2 special, beautifully braided loaves of bread, their surfaces glossy with a wash of egg and sprinkled with precious sesame seeds. They sat on a platter, covered with an embroidered cloth, looking more like offerings than mere food. David watched as his mother carefully filled a small, elegant clay jar with dark, sweet wine, a luxury reserved for Sabbaths and festivals. The rich, fruity scent mingled with the aroma of a slow-cooking lentil stew, enriched with more herbs and a finer cut of meat than on a common day. The extra bread, the wine, the special stew, each item was a tangible sign of distinction, setting this meal and this day apart from all others. His most important duty came next. His father, Jacob, brought out the finest woven mat, reserved only for the Sabbath table, and laid it over the low eating platform. David's task was to set the places. He arranged the simple clay bowls and cups with meticulous care, his small hands making sure each was perfectly aligned. He placed the platter with the two special loaves in the center, a symbol of the double portion of manna God had provided for the Israelites in the wilderness. Beside it, he set the jar of wine and the lamp, its wick untrimmed and ready. The simple table, transformed by these elements and by his careful attention, no longer looked like their everyday eating space. It had become an altar, a focal point for the holiness about to descend upon their home. As he placed the final cup, David paused and looked around. The house was spotless, filled with the inviting smells of the special foods. The table was set, a silent promise of the feast and fellowship to come. Outside, the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. The first star appeared, a lone, brilliant pinprick in the deepening blue. A shiver of pure, unadulterated excitement ran through him. This was not the boisterous joy of his cousin's visit, but something deeper, a quiet, thrilling awe that tightened his chest and made his breath catch. The weight of the week, the dust from the grinding stone, the fatigue from his chores, it all fell away, replaced by a luminous sense of expectation. The Sabbath was not just a day of rest, it was a divine guest, a presence of holiness that was now crossing their threshold. He felt it settling over their clean home, over the prepared table, and deep within his own spirit. The holy day was beginning, and he was ready, his heart beating in time with the ancient sacred rhythm of its arrival. Chapter 6. The Sabbath Meal. The final sliver of sun vanished, and the first star blossomed in the twilight sky, a silent signal that the Sabbath had officially begun. Inside the clean, fragrant house, a profound stillness descended, a holy hush that seemed to absorb all sound. The family gathered around the carefully set table, their faces illuminated by the soft, warm glow of the oil lamp. Jacob, his demeanor shifting from the industrious father to the spiritual head of the household, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He stood before the Sabbath lamp, its clean wick waiting, a new clay. Jar of olive oil beside it, reserved for this sacred purpose. David watched, his breath held, as his father struck a flame to life. The small fire caught the wick, flickered for a moment, and then steadied into a single, unwavering tongue of light. Jacob's hands circled the flame 3 times, a silent, ancient gesture of welcome, before he recited the blessing, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the house. The light was no longer just a practical tool against the darkness. It had become the Sabbath light, a symbol of God's creation and the divine soul granted to humanity. With the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Jacob then lifted the jar of wine. The dark liquid caught the light, glinting like a deep red jewel. He filled a single, special cup, the kiddush cup, to the brim. Holding it aloft in his work-roughened hands, he began to sing. The melody was ancient and haunting, rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of deserts and deliverance, of creation and covenant. David knew the words, had heard them every week of his life, but tonight they felt new. They were not just recited, they were poured forth, a liquid stream of praise that sanctified the day, setting it apart from the 6 days of labor. The sound wrapped around the family, a tangible presence in the room. David listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole being, feeling the words settle into the quiet spaces within him. Then came the bread. Jacob's hands, now covered with a finely woven cloth, rested upon the two beautiful braided loaves his mother had prepared. These were not the simple daily flatbreads. They were the challah, rich and golden, a visual and tangible representation of the double portion of heaven-sent sustenance. His father's voice rose again in blessing, thanking God who brings forth bread from the earth. At the words, Jacob lifted the cloth, revealing the loaves in all their glory, and then carefully broke a piece from each one. He sprinkled the pieces with a dusting of salt, a reminder of the temple sacrifices, and passed a piece to each member of the family. David took his piece, the warm, soft bread, a comforting weight in his palm. He did not eat it immediately. He looked at his parents, their faces serene and radiant in the lamplight. He looked at his sister, her usual restiveness replaced by a quiet awe. He felt the peace of the moment, a deep, resonant stillness that was both within him and all around him. It was a different peace than the quiet of the early morning or the satisfaction after a day's work. This was a spiritual peace, a palpable sense of God's presence dwelling among them in the light, in the wine, in the bread, in their gathered hearts. The worries of the week, the dust of the fields, the weight of tomorrow, all of it was held at bay by the sacred boundary of this day. In the gentle flicker of the Sabbath lamp, surrounded by the lingering melody of the prayers and the profound silence that followed, David felt a connection to something vast and eternal. He was not just a boy in Nazareth sharing a meal with his family. He was a link in a chain of generations, all honoring the same God, all pausing at the same sacred threshold, all feeling the same profound and perfect peace descend with the Sabbath night. The first bites of the special Sabbath meal were eaten in a silence that felt rich and full, a continuation of the prayers that had sanctified the evening. The lentil stew tasted deeper, the braided bread softer, the wine sweeter, each flavor heightened by the holiness that permeated the air. As the initial reverence settled into a comfortable warmth, David's young mind, nourished by the peas and the food, began to turn over a question that had been growing within him all evening. He watched his father's relaxed posture, so different from his usual weary slump after a long week of labor, and he looked at his mother's face, free from the lines of daily concern. He set down his piece of bread, the crumbs clinging to his fingers, and turned to Jacob, his voice a soft interruption of the quiet. He asked why. Why did they stop everything? Why did the whole village grow still? Why was this day so different from all the others? Jacob finished chewing his mouthful of bread slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he looked at his son. He did not answer immediately, but instead reached for the wine cup, taking a small sip as if gathering the words from a deep well of tradition. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured, explaining that the Sabbath was not merely a command, but a gift. It was a divine echo, a weekly remembrance of the seventh day, when God himself had rested from the magnificent work of creation. By resting, they were not being idle. They were honoring the rhythm of the universe, acknowledging that the world and all its bounty belonged ultimately to God. Their pause was an act of faith, a testament that their lives and their sustenance were in his hands. Sarah added to the explanation, her words weaving a tapestry of stories from the Torah that David had heard since infancy, but which now took on new, vivid life. She spoke of the breath of God moving over the waters, of light bursting forth from nothingness, of the sun and moon set in their courses. She described the great work of the 6 days, the sprouting of every plant, the swimming of every fish, the flight of every bird, all culminating in that first perfect rest. As she spoke, David could almost see it, the finished, pristine world humming with life, and the Creator pausing to behold it all and call it very good. Their own Sabbath rest, she explained, was a tiny reflection of that first cosmic Sabbath. Their clean home was like the ordered world, their special meal a celebration of its abundance, and their gathered family a mirror of the harmony God intended. David listened, his stew forgotten, his eyes wide. He looked around the table at the half-eaten braided loaves that symbolized the double portion of manna, at the wine that spoke of joy and covenant, at the faces of his family illuminated by the steadfast flame of the Sabbath lamp. In that moment, the fragments of his understanding clicked into place like the pieces of a puzzle. The gratitude his mother taught him at dawn, the patient work of grinding grain with his father, the joy of sharing bread with cousins, the sacred preparation for this very evening, it was all connected. Every meal, from the simplest breakfast to this lavish Sabbath feast, was a thread in a single, continuous story. It was the story of their relationship with God, with each other, and with the land He had given them. The food on the table was no longer just food. The bread was the manna in the wilderness. The wine was the joy of God's provision. The stew was the fruit of the earth He had created. This meal, and every meal, was a holy act, a constant renewal of their faith. It was how they remembered who they were and to whom they belonged. A profound sense of understanding settled over David, as warm and solid as the bread in his hand. He picked it up again and took a bite, chewing slowly. He tasted not just flour and water, but tradition, covenant, and a peace that surpassed all the wearying labors of the week. He finally saw the beautiful, unbreakable chain that connected the food they ate to the faith they lived, a chain forged in gratitude, strengthened by work, and celebrated in rest, meal by sacred meal. Chapter 7. A Stranger at the Gate. The last embers of the Sabbath were fading from the sky, the deep indigo of evening settling over Nazareth like a soft blanket. A profound quiet had enveloped the village, the holiness of the day slowly giving way to the gentle rest of the night. Inside David's home, the lingering sense of peace was almost a physical presence, a warmth that clung to the clean-swept floor and the faint, sweet scent of wine that still perfumed the air. The family sat in a comfortable silence, the soft glow of the oil lamp painting their relaxed faces in gold, each lost in the afterglow of the sacred meal. Then a sound cut through the stillness, not the familiar call of a night bird or the rustle of a breeze, but a slow, hesitant knock on the wooden gate that led into their small courtyard. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in the Sabbath quiet, that it seemed to vibrate in the very silence itself. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. His father, Jacob, did not startle. Instead, he rose with a calm that seemed to deepen the peace in the room rather than break it. He moved to the doorway, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted night. David scrambled to his feet and followed, his curiosity a live thing in his chest. Peering around his father's solid frame, he saw a man standing at their gate. He was shrouded in the dust of long travel, his cloak frayed at the edges. and his sandals worn thin. In the dim light, his face was etched with a fatigue so profound it seemed to weigh down his very shoulders. He was a stranger, an unknown quantity in their familiar closed world. Without a moment of hesitation, without a single question, Jacob unlatched the gate and swung it open. He did not speak, but his gesture was a language in itself, a wide, welcoming sweep of his arm that invited the darkness and the stranger inside. The traveler's eyes, shadowed and weary, met Jacob's, and a look of profound, weary gratitude passed between them. As the man stepped across the threshold, Sarah was already in motion. The peace of the Sabbath had not left her. It had simply shifted its form into action. She moved to the storage jars, her movements fluid and sure. She brought out a round of the special braided Sabbath bread, its soft texture a treasure, and a bowl of their finest olives, glossy and black. She placed them on the table alongside a cup of fresh water, her action speaking of a duty so ingrained it was instinct. The family made space for the stranger at their table, the circle widening to include him. Jacob brought a basin of water and a cloth, and with a quiet humility that struck David deeply, he knelt to wash the dust of the road from the man's tired feet. The traveler accepted this service with a slow, grateful nod, the tension visibly seeping from his body. David watched the entire scene, his young mind trying to process the swift, silent flow of events. They knew nothing of this man, not his name, not his village, not his story. He could have been anyone. Yet he was welcomed not as a potential burden or a threat, but as an honored guest. The best of their food was given without a second thought, their comfort offered without condition. As the stranger ate the bread and olives with the slow, deliberate motions of a man who had known hunger, David looked from his father's serene face to his mother's compassionate eyes. He understood. This was not merely kindness. It was a law written not on scrolls, but on the heart. It was the law of hospitality, a sacred duty passed down from Abraham, who had welcomed 3 strangers into his tent, and in doing so had entertained angels. To turn away a traveler at dusk was to turn away a blessing, to refuse a divine appointment. The safety of their home, the food on their table, these were not solely for their own keeping. They were gifts to be shared, instruments of a covenant that demanded the welcome of the stranger, in the quiet acceptance of his parents, in the simple offering of bread and a place to rest. David saw a faith that was lived, not just prayed. He learned in that moment that the holiest of duties was not always found in the grand rituals of the Sabbath, but sometimes in a dusty cloak at the gate, and that the most profound welcome was the one given to a face you had never seen before. Chapter 8, The Traveler's Story. The simple meal of bread and olives became a feast of words, a banquet of distant horizons, served upon the worn wood of their table. As the traveler ate, his weariness seemed to melt away, replaced by a light that kindled in his eyes, a fire stoked by memory and the simple human need to share his journey. The last crumbs of the Sabbath loaf were brushed from his fingers, and he took a slow sip of water, his gaze turning inward, gathering the threads of tales from lands beyond the hills of Nazareth. David, seated cross-legged on the floor mat, leaned forward, his own world of grinding stones and village paths, feeling suddenly small and wonderfully expandable. The traveler began to speak, his voice a low rhythmic instrument that painted pictures in the dim lamplight. He described the desert first, a vast sun-scorched sea of sand that stretched to the edge of the world. He spoke of dunes that shifted with the wind, creating mountains and valleys that vanished overnight, of a silence so profound it was like a physical weight, and of a sky at night that was a dizzying spill of stars, so close one felt they could be gathered like cold, bright fruit. David could almost feel the gritty heat, see the shimmering mirages of water that taunted thirsty travelers, and hear the mournful cry of a desert wind that knew no boundaries. He described caravans of camels, great patient beasts that moved like ships on a golden ocean, their bells making a lonely music that was the only sound for days. Then, his voice shifting like a turning tide, the traveler spoke of the sea. David, who had only ever seen the distant shimmering blue of the Sea of Galilee from a high hill, listened in awe as the man described the great sea, a roiling, endless expanse of water that was the color of dark wine and deep shadows. He told of waves taller than houses, of storms that could toss a ship like a toy, and of the eerie, glassy calm that could follow. He spoke of ports teeming with a chaos of humanity, merchants from Rome with their strange accents, sailors with skin tanned to leather, and the smells of spices and salt and tar that hung thick in the air. He described fish that glowed with their own cold fire in the night waters, and distant shores where cities of white stone climbed hillsides under a foreign sun. David was utterly captivated, his food forgotten, his own breathing shallow. He was no longer in the small stone house in Nazareth. He was walking beside the traveler, feeling the burning sand beneath his sandals, tasting the salt spray on his lips, his heart pounding with the thrill of the unknown. He watched the man's face animated and alive now, his hands tracing the shapes of dunes and the swell of waves in the air. And he saw with a dawning clarity how this transformation had been wrought. It was the bread. The simple act of breaking and sharing their food had been a key, turning a lock in the stranger's heart. The offering of sustenance had become an invitation, a silent promise of safety and trust that had unlocked these treasures of memory. The barrier of strangeness had dissolved over the shared olives and the gift of the special bread. The traveler was no longer just a dusty man at the gate. He was a storyteller, a friend who was trusting them with the maps of his life. David looked from the traveler's expressive face to the kind, listening faces of his parents, and he understood the profound alchemy of hospitality. Food did more than fill a hungry stomach. It built a bridge between souls. It opened guarded hearts and built friendships, not on years of familiarity, but on the immediate sacred ground of a shared meal. The stories of deserts and seas were not just entertainment. They were gifts, given in return for the gifts of bread and welcome. A beautiful exchange that turned a stranger into a companion under the same roof, bound together by the timeless universal language of a meal shared. Chapter 9. Harvest Time. The first light of dawn found the entire village of Nazareth already in motion, a river of purposeful energy flowing toward the golden barley fields that rippled on the hillsides. The air, cool and fresh with the retreating night, hummed with collective anticipation that was almost tangible. For David, waking to this unusual bustle was like stepping into a different world. The familiar rhythm of his small family's morning was replaced by the grand, synchronized pulse of the community, all hearts and hands united in a single sacred task: Today was harvest, and every soul, from the eldest elder to the smallest child, had a role to play in gathering the bounty God had provided. The field was a breathtaking sight, a sea of gold swaying in the gentle morning breeze, each stalk heavy with grain, bowing its head as if in gratitude. The men, David's father Jacob among them, moved in a steady, rhythmic line at the field's edge, their sickles flashing in the rising sun. With each sweeping arc, a swath of barley fell, the sound a crisp, satisfying whisper that spoke of abundance and fulfillment. Behind them came the women and older children, their backs bent as they gathered the fallen stalks into neat, orderly sheaves, tying them with deft twists of straw. The air filled with the rich, dusty, sweet scent of cut grain, a perfume of prosperity that was the very breath of the season. David, along with the other younger children, was tasked with gathering the scattered sheaves and carrying them to the central threshing floor, a flat, hard-packed area of cleared earth. The sheaves were surprisingly heavy for his small frame, the rough stalks prickling against his arms as he hoisted them. At first, his movements were clumsy, his pace slow as he navigated the stubble of the field. But as he worked, he fell into the rhythm of the others. He saw Reuben, his cousin, laughing as he wrestled with a particularly large bundle, and he saw the village elders working alongside the strongest youths. No distinction between them in this shared labor. There were no solitary tasks here. Every armful he carried was a piece of a vast communal puzzle. The feeling was infectious, a joyous energy that made the hard work feel like a celebration. His initial fatigue was washed away by a current of shared purpose, and a profound sense of belonging warmed him from within. He was not just Jacob's son, he was a part of Nazareth, a living thread in the fabric of his people, contributing to the survival and joy of all. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the golden sea had been transformed. The field stood shorn, a landscape of pale stubble under the bright sky, while the threshing floor was a growing mountain of golden sheaves, a testament to their collective effort. The work ceased as if by an unspoken signal. The villagers gathered at the field's edge, their faces glistening with sweat, but radiant with satisfaction. They found patches of shade under the few scattered olive trees and on the cool earth, their bodies weary, but their spirits soaring. Then the feast began. It was not a lavish meal, but a simple, profound sharing of what each family had brought: rounds of flatbread, clay jars of yogurt and honey, baskets of early figs, and skins of tart, watered wine. There were no separate family circles today. Food and drink were passed freely from hand to hand. A neighbor's bread broken and shared with a friend, a child handed a fig by an elder they barely knew. David sat between his father and Reuben, chewing on a piece of bread someone had given him, its taste infinitely better for being eaten in the open air, surrounded by the laughter and easy conversation of the entire village. He watched the faces around him, the shared smiles, the nods of camaraderie, the unspoken understanding that passed between them all. The joy he felt was not just his own, it was a collective joy, woven from the threads of every individual's effort, and now celebrated in their shared rest and sustenance. As the meal drew to a close, Jacob rose to his feet. A respectful quiet fell over the gathered villagers. He did not need to call for attention. His standing was enough. He looked out over their faces, then over the shorn field and the mountain of sheaves. His expression one of deep, humble gratitude. He lifted his hands and his voice to the heavens, offering a prayer of thanks to God, the master of the harvest, who had sent the sun and the rain, who had made the seed to sprout and the grain to ripen. He thanked him for the strength in their arms and the unity in their hearts. As the familiar words of blessing washed over him, David looked around at his community, at the fruits of their labor piled high, and at the simple, shared remains of their meal. He felt the circle complete, the hard work, the joyous collaboration, and now the grateful rest. The harvest was more than barley. It was faith made visible, community made strong, and God's provision celebrated not in a synagogue, but in a sun-drenched field with dirty hands and full hearts under the wide, benevolent sky. Chapter 10. The Feast of First Fruits. The barley harvest, gathered with such joyous effort, was not an end, but a beginning. Days later, a different kind of energy coursed through Nazareth, one of solemn celebration and sacred offering. The Feast of First Fruits had arrived, a day when the village would present the very first yield of the harvest to God, acknowledging that the land and its bounty were ultimately His. The air itself seemed to shimmer with a mixture of reverence and festivity, the dusty streets filling with families carrying the tangible proof of God's faithfulness. David, walking beside his father with a carefully woven basket in his hands, felt a quiet awe settle over him, a feeling far deeper than the boisterous joy of the harvest day. His basket held their family's offering, two of the finest, most perfectly round loaves of bread, baked from the flour of the first threshed barley, and a small cluster of early figs, their skins a delicate green gold. These were not just food, they were symbols, the first and best of what their labor and the land had produced. He carried them with a sense of profound responsibility, his small hands gripping the basket's handle tightly. All around them, their neighbors moved in the same purposeful stream toward the local synagogue, each family bearing their own gifts, baskets of gleaming wheat sheaves, clay pots of new wine still fermenting, platters of olives and pomegranates, all the first yield of their fields and trees. It was a river of gratitude flowing toward the house of God, a silent moving prayer of thanksgiving. The synagogue, usually a place of quiet study and weekly prayer, was transformed. The central space was a vibrant tapestry of color and abundance, a growing mountain of offerings piling high before the ark that held the sacred scrolls. The scent was intoxicating, the dusty sweetness of grain, the rich aroma of fresh bread, the sharp tang of new wine, and the floral perfume of ripe fruits, all mingling into a fragrance of pure devotion. The village priests, dressed in their clean white linen robes, moved among the people with serene authority, their hands raised in blessing as they received each family's gift. Their voices, chanting the ancient prayers of dedication, wove a canopy of holiness over the bustling scene, their words a bridge between the earthly offerings and the heavenly recipient. David watched, mesmerized, as his father placed their basket with the others. Jacob's movements were slow and deliberate, his face a mask of humble reverence. A priest approached, placed his hands briefly over their offering, and recited the blessing, his voice a resonant hum that seemed to sanctify the bread and figs, setting them apart for God. In that moment, David understood the ritual in a way he never had before. This was not about giving away something they needed. It was an act of trust. It was declaring with tangible proof that God was the source of all provision, and that by giving him the first portion, they were trusting him to provide for all the portions to come. The awe he felt was a physical pressure in his chest, a recognition of the divine covenant made visible in bread and fruit. After the last offering was given and the final prayer chanted, the solemnity of the ritual seamlessly blossomed into a communal feast. The offerings that had been sanctified were now, in part, redistributed, shared among the villagers as a holy meal. The priests broke the loaves and passed out pieces of the blessed bread, and the fruits were divided among the families. David received a piece of a loaf from another family's offering, its taste somehow richer, more significant. They sat in the courtyard of the synagogue, the entire village sharing in the bounty they had just dedicated to God. The mood was light, filled with laughter and conversation, but beneath it all thrummed the profound satisfaction of the completed ritual. As David ate the festive meal, the flavors of the consecrated bread and shared fruits mingling on his tongue, he looked around at the faces of his community, all nourished by the same holy gifts. The awe he had felt during the offering now melted into a deep, resonant joy. The Feast of First Fruits was not a somber duty. It was a celebration of the beautiful cyclical relationship between God and his people, a relationship of giving, receiving, and sharing, all bound together by faith, gratitude, and the simple, sacred act of breaking bread together. Chapter 11. Fishing with Father. The pre-dawn darkness was a deep, velvety blue, the stars still sharp and brilliant over Nazareth, when Jacob gently shook David awake. There was no need for words. The boy's eyes flew open, instantly alert, with an excitement that had kept him teetering on the edge of sleep all night. This was the day. They were going to the Sea of Galilee. In the main room, his mother, Sarah, pressed a small bundle of bread and cheese into his hands and a water skin into Jacob's, her smile a silent blessing in the lamplight. Then they were out the door, their footsteps the only sound in the sleeping village, the cool air sharp and clean in their lungs. They joined a small, silent group of other men and boys from the village, their forms dark shadows against the fading night, all moving with a single, purposeful intent toward the distant, shimmering expanse of water that lay cradled between the hills. As they walked, the sky began to soften, bleeding from indigo into shades of lavender and rose. The first rays of the sun crested the eastern hills, striking the sea and setting its surface ablaze with liquid gold. The sight stole David's breath. He had seen the sea from afar, a blue ribbon on the horizon, but this was different. Up close, it was a living, breathing entity, its vastness both thrilling and humbling. The air smelled of wet stone, fish, and sun-warmed earth, a potent, unfamiliar perfume that spoke of a world beyond his village. The fishing boats, drawn up on the pebbled shore, looked like great, sleeping beasts, their nets piled high like tangled silver webs. Jacob led David to their family's boat, a weathered wooden craft that smelled strongly of tar and old fish. Together with the other men, they pushed it into the shallows, the cold water a shock against David's legs. Once they were a little way out, Jacob unrolled the nets. They were heavier than they looked, a complex web of cords and weights, smelling of the lake and countless catches. Jacob's hands, usually stained with the dust of the carpenter's shop, moved with a different kind of expertise here, checking the knots, coiling the lines with a fluid practiced grace. He showed David how to hold a section of the net, how to feel the potential in its weighted edge. Then, with a powerful sweeping motion born of a lifetime of practice, he cast it. The net flew from his hands, unfolding in a perfect wide circle against the brightening sky before settling onto the water with a soft splash and sinking swiftly beneath the surface, the floats bobbing like a string of beads. They waited in a comfortable silence, the boat rocking gently on the small swells. The only sounds were the lap of water against the hull and the distant cries of gulls wheeling overhead. David watched his father's face, calm and patient, his eyes scanning the water as if he could read secrets in its depths. After a time, Jacob began to pull the net back in, hand over hand, his muscles straining with the slow, heavy resistance. David scrambled to help, his small hands grabbing the wet, rough rope, pulling with all his might. As the net broke the surface, it erupted in a frantic, glittering chaos. Dozens of fish, their scales flashing silver in the morning sun, flapped and twisted in the mesh, a miraculous, writhing harvest pulled from the deep. The sight was dazzling, a burst of life and abundance that made David gasp aloud. As they worked to untangle the catch, Jacob's low, steady voice began to weave a story into the morning air. He spoke not of their own small catch, but of another time on this very sea. He told David of a man named Jesus, a teacher from Nazareth, and of the fishermen he had called to be his disciples, men just like them with calloused hands and boats and nets. He described a day when one of those disciples, a man named Peter, had fished all night and caught nothing, but at Jesus' word, he had let down his nets one more time into the deep water, and they had hauled in such a tremendous catch that the nets began to break and the boats began to sink from the weight of it. David listened, his hand stilling, a small silvery fish forgotten in his grasp. He looked from the teeming net in their boat to his father's earnest face, and then out across the vast, sun-dazzled water. Jacob's story was not just a tale. It was a key, unlocking a deeper meaning in the world around him. The fish they had caught were not just food. They were a reminder of that miraculous catch, a testament to a faith that could command the very depths. Jacob went on, linking that story to others, of a few loaves and fishes that had fed a multitude on a hillside, of a simple meal in an upper room that had changed the world. He spoke of how every meal, from the fish they would eat tonight to the bread they broke each day, was connected to these moments, these miracles. Food was not just sustenance. It was a vessel for faith, a tangible sign of God's provision and power. The boat felt different on the return journey, riding lower in the water, heavy with their blessing from the sea. David sat amid the baskets of still flapping fish, their cold, slick bodies pressing against his legs. He was no longer just a boy who had gone fishing. He was a part of a story that stretched back to disciples in a boat on this same sea, to miracles on hillsides, to a faith that saw the hand of God in every net cast and every loaf broken. The glittering scales of the fish seemed to hold a reflected light that was more than just the sun, and the familiar briny smell was now the scent of wonder, a holy reminder that the simplest acts of daily life, like casting a net or sharing a meal, could be woven into the very fabric of divine grace. Chapter 12. The Fish Supper. The journey back from the Sea of Galilee was filled with a new and profound sense of purpose. The baskets of fish, still twitching with the last vestiges of life, were not just a successful catch. They were a tangible answer to prayer, a shimmering silver harvest from the deep that felt like a direct blessing. The weight of the baskets, carried between David and his father, was a comfortable, promising weight, each sloshing step a reminder of the morning's miracle and the stories that had given it meaning. The sun was high and warm on their backs as they entered Nazareth. The village sounds, the bleating of goats, the chatter of women at the well, feeling familiar and yet somehow new, viewed through the lens of their dripping, abundant bounty. Back inside the cool dimness of their home, the fish were transformed from a catch into a sacrament. Sarah's eyes lit up at the sight, her hands moving with swift, practiced grace. She took the largest fish, its scales still gleaming with trapped lake light, and laid it upon a clean stone slab. With a sharp knife, she cleaned it, the sharp, briny scent of the sea filling the small room, a foreign and exciting perfume among the usual smells of bread and earth. David watched, mesmerized as she rinsed the pearly flesh, then carefully stuffed the cavity with fresh sprigs of rosemary and thyme, gathered from the hillside, their pungent, piney aroma rising to mix with the scent of the fish. She rubbed the skin with a precious drizzle of olive oil and a dusting of coarse salt, each gesture a ritual of preparation, an act of honoring the gift they had been given. The fish was then placed on a flat clay tile and slid into the still hot belly of the oven, the last of the morning's baking embers now repurposed for this special supper. As it baked, the sharp, clean scent of the sea slowly melded with the earthy, herbal fragrance of the rosemary and thyme, creating a rich, savory aroma that made David's stomach clench with anticipation. It was a smell of celebration, of abundance, a marked departure from their usual meals of lentils and bread. The family moved around each other, setting the table, their movements synchronized in a quiet, joyful expectancy. The ordinary was being made holy. When the fish was done, Sarah brought it to the table. It was a magnificent sight, its skin crisped to a golden brown, the herbs within steaming and fragrant. It was placed in the center of the low table, the undisputed centerpiece of their meal. The family gathered around, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the evening lamp. They did not immediately eat. Instead, they bowed their heads, and Jacob's voice, still rough from the lake air, rose in a prayer of thanks. But this prayer was different from the ones over their daily bread. His words were filled with a fresh, vivid gratitude for the mysteries of the deep, for the teeming life within the sea, for the safe journey and the full nets. He thanked God for the gift of this food, a direct provision from the vast, untamable waters that had once parted for their ancestors and had now yielded its bounty for their table. Then they ate. Jacob broke the crisp skin with his fingers, revealing the flaky, steaming white flesh beneath. He served portions to Sarah, then to David, and finally to himself. The first bite was a revelation. The flavor was like nothing David had ever tasted. The clean, rich taste of the lake infused with the woody warmth of the herbs and the fruity sharpness of the oil. It was a complex, wonderful taste, a symphony of earth, water, and fire. They ate joyfully, their fingers glistening, the simple act of consuming this meal feeling like a participation in something ancient and miraculous. There was little conversation, only the sounds of happy eating and contented sighs, the shared pleasure of the feast binding them together. As David savored the last flakes of fish from his piece, licking the savory oil from his fingers, his mind drifted back to the morning, to the glittering net, his father's story of the miraculous catch, and the vast, sun-dazzled sea. He looked at the clean-picked skeleton of the fish on the platter, a ghostly architecture of bones. This food was not like the grain from the field or the fruit from the tree, things planted and tended by human hands. This was a gift drawn from the wild, deep heart of creation, a blessing that had been swimming in hidden depths just hours before. It was a stark, beautiful reminder that God's provision was not limited to the tilled soil of their village, but extended to the untamed waters, to the mysteries of the deep. The fish supper was more than a meal. It was a lesson in the boundless, surprising grace of God, a grace that could arrive not just as bread from the earth, but as a shimmering silver harvest from the sea, seasoned with herbs and eaten with a joy that tasted very much of faith. Chapter 13, A Goat for Celebration. The bleating was a new sound in the small courtyard, a plaintive, insistent cry that spoke of change and the weight of impending significance. The young goat, its coat the color of dust and shadow, stood tethered to the post near the water trough, its liquid brown eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored the strange, solemn excitement brewing in David's own heart. The animal had been purchased by his father Jacob, not for milk or for breeding, but for a purpose far grander and more final. It was for a wedding. The son of their neighbor, a young man David had watched grow from a boisterous boy to a serious bridegroom, was to be married, and their family's contribution to the great feast was this very goat. Its presence transformed their humble home into a way station for celebration, a place where daily life brushed up against the sacred milestones that gave it shape and meaning. David's assigned duty was to tend the animal until the day of the feast. It was a responsibility he took with a gravity that tightened his chest. Each morning, he brought it a handful of the sweetest, most tender clover he could find, watching as the goat's soft lips nibbled the greens from his palm, its trust a fragile, living thing. He made sure its water was clean and fresh, scooping out the old and replacing it with cool, clear water from the well. In the heat of the afternoon, he would sit in the patch of shade cast by the house, and the goat would eventually settle nearby, its warm flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. David would run his hand over its coarse, warm fur, feeling the life thrumming beneath, the quick, bird-like beat of its heart. He knew this peaceful companionship was temporary, a brief interlude before the sacrifice. The knowledge cast a poignant shadow over their moments together, teaching him a quiet, difficult lesson about the cost of joy, the sober truth that profound celebration often stood hand in hand with profound offering. On the evening before the wedding, as the family shared their simple meal of bread and lentils, the goat's occasional bleat from the courtyard wove itself into their conversation. Jacob, his gaze thoughtful, spoke of how special meals like the wedding feast to come were the pillars upon which a community built its memory. They were not merely about filling stomachs, but about marking the irrevocable turns in the river of life, births, marriages, even deaths. He described how the sharing of a significant animal, a fatted calf, or a chosen goat elevated a gathering from a simple meal to a sacred event. It was a tangible surrender of something valuable, a shared investment in the happiness and future of another. The sacrifice of the goat was not an act of loss, but one of communal gain, its life transformed into the sustenance that would fuel songs, dances, and the forging of new bonds. Sarah added her own wisdom, her voice soft as the twilight settling outside. She explained that these feasts were echoes of their relationship with God. Just as they offered the first fruits of their harvest at the temple, they offered the best of their flocks and their labor to celebrate the milestones of their neighbors. It was a cycle of giving and receiving, of sacrifice and blessing, that wove the individual families of Nazareth into a single, resilient tapestry. The food at a wedding feast was a language, she said, its richness and abundance speaking of hope for the couple's future, of the community's support, and of gratitude for God's gift of love and new beginnings. David listened, his eyes drifting toward the courtyard where the goat was now a dark, quiet shape in the gathering dusk. He thought of his own hands feeding it, of the trust in its eyes, and he felt a complex knot of emotions, sadness for the animal's fate, but also a dawning understanding of the profound symbolism it carried. The goat was not just an animal, it was a vessel. Its life would become the centerpiece of a joy so large it required the whole village to hold it. The sacrifice was the foundation upon which the celebration would be built, a necessary offering that gave the feast its weight and its meaning. As he finished his meal, the simple lentils and bread tasted different, a quiet prelude to the extravagant sacrificial meal to come. He understood now that the most important meals were those that cost something, those that marked a line between what was and what would be, and that the food shared there was seasoned with more than just salt and herbs. It was seasoned with memory, hope, and the sacred, sobering, and beautiful truth of sacrifice. Chapter 14, The Wedding Feast. The air in Nazareth hummed with a different frequency, a vibration of pure, unadulterated joy that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the village. The wedding day had arrived, and the usual quiet rhythms of life were swept away by a tide of celebration. From his family's courtyard, David could hear the distant rising sound of flutes and drums, a lively, insistent rhythm that pulled at his feet, promising merriment long before he even reached the feast. The path to the bridegroom's family home, usually a dusty track, was now a river of color and motion, filled with villagers dressed in their finest woven tunics, their faces alight with smiles and anticipation. The scent of celebration was a complex perfume, the dusty sweetness of trampled earth, the floral notes of wreaths adorning doorways, and, riding over it all, the most tantalizing aroma of all, roasting meat. As David and his family entered the wide, open space where the feast was laid out, the sight made him stop in his tracks, his eyes widening to take in the spectacle of abundance. Long, low tables, fashioned from planks laid across trestles, groaned under the weight of the village's collective offering. They were a tapestry of texture and color, a landscape of generosity. Great, round loaves of bread, their crusts dusted with flour, were piled high like golden hills. Baskets overflowed with the season's bounty. Plump purple figs split open to reveal their amber hearts. Clusters of deep red grapes, still glistening with morning dew, and pale green almonds in their fuzzy husks. There were bowls of glossy black olives swimming in oil, trays of creamy white cheese, and shallow dishes of golden honey, their surfaces shimmering in the afternoon sun. But the centerpiece, the anchor of this glorious feast, was the roasted goat. The animal David had tended with such care was now transformed, its body turned to a crackling mahogany-brown masterpiece, glistening with herbs and slow-cooked to tender perfection. It lay on a great wooden platter at the center of the main table, a silent, powerful testament to sacrifice and celebration. Men were already carving it, the long knife sliding easily through the flesh, releasing a cloud of savory steam that made David's mouth water. The air was thick with its rich, gamey scent, mingling with the yesty smell of bread and the sweet perfume of fruit, creating an intoxicating atmosphere that was the very essence of festivity. All around him, the community was in motion, a living, breathing organism of shared happiness. Women moved between the tables, replenishing platters and pressing extra portions of bread into the hands of the elderly. Men clapped each other on the back, their laughter booming over the music. Children weaved through the forest of legs, their high-pitched shrieks of delight adding another layer to the symphony of joy. David saw the faces of his neighbors, the carpenter, the potter, the widow Miriam, the fisherman from the lake, all their individual cares and daily toils forgotten, smoothed away by the collective effervescence of the occasion. There were no strangers here today. The shared anticipation of the feast had dissolved all barriers, weaving everyone into a single, joyous fabric. He found a place to sit on a spread rug near his parents. His plate soon filled with a piece of the tender goat, a hunk of the soft bread, and a handful of figs. As he ate, the flavors exploded on his tongue. The savory, herb-infused meat, the chewy, substantial bread, perfect for soaking up the juices, the burst of honeyed sweetness from the figs. But the true nourishment was not in the food itself. It was in the atmosphere that surrounded him, the palpable warmth of community sharing. He watched as a piece of bread was broken and passed from one hand to another, as a skin of wine was shared between old friends, as a platter of fruit was offered to a group of children. This was more than a meal. It was a living prayer of gratitude, a celebration of life and continuity, a visible manifestation of the bonds that held their small world together. In the midst of the music, the laughter, and the incredible abundance, David felt a profound, swelling happiness settle in his chest. He was not just eating. He was participating in a sacred act of community, a feast where every bite was a taste of shared life and every smile was a thread in the unbreakable tapestry of belonging. The rhythm of the feast was a living pulse, shifting from the focused intensity of the meal to the expansive, joyful release of celebration. As the last of the roasted goat was savored and the final crumbs of bread brushed from fingers, the musicians, who had been providing a soft backdrop of melody, surged into a new, more vigorous tune. The beat of the drum quickened, a heartbeat for the gathering, and the plaintive cry of the flute wove through it, an irresistible call to motion. Almost as one, the villagers began to rise, their bodies responding to the ancient, compelling rhythm. A space was cleared in the center of the courtyard, the dust stirring underfoot, ready to be stamped into a tapestry of joy. David found himself swept into the current of the dance. He was pulled into a wide, circling chain of dancers, his small hand clasped firmly in the calloused palm of a fisherman on one side and the soft, wrinkled hand of the village elder on the other. The steps were simple, a pattern of stomps and sways and linked turns that he had seen at every village celebration since he could walk. But tonight he was no longer just a spectator. He was a part of the living circle. His feet, clumsy at first, soon found the rhythm, stomping in time with the drum, his body moving with the flow of the chain as it wove in and out, a human braid of shared exhilaration. He looked around at the faces in the circle, flushed, smiling, eyes closed in bliss or sparkling with mischief, and felt his own joy magnified, reflected, and amplified 100-fold in the community around him. The dance was not just movement, it was a physical expression of their unity, a celebration that required every body, every voice, every joined hand. When the dance finally slowed, the dancers, breathless and laughing, they collapsed onto rugs and cushions in loose, happy clusters. The elders, their faces creased with smiles and the wisdom of years, settled in a circle of their own, their presence a grounding force amidst the youthful energy. One of them, a man named Ezra, whose beard was as white as the winter snow on Mount Tabor, cleared his throat, and a respectful quiet fell. He began to speak, his voice a low, rasping instrument that commanded attention. He did not tell new stories, but old ones, the foundational tales of their people. He spoke of the great wedding, feasts of the patriarchs, of Isaac and Rebekah, and of the songs of Solomon that celebrated love as strong as death. He wove these ancient threads with stories of Nazareth itself, of weddings past, of couples whose love had weathered drought and hardship, of children born and generations secured. His words were not a history lesson, but a weaving, connecting the joy of this specific night to the timeless, enduring joy of their people. David listened, curled near his father's side, the fatigue from the dance a pleasant warmth in his limbs. He watched the faces of the listeners, young and old, all turned toward the storyteller, their expression soft and reflective. He saw the bride and groom seated together on a slightly raised platform, listening to the tales of enduring love, their intertwined hands a living promise against the backdrop of the stories. And in that moment, a profound realization dawned within him, as clear and steady as the drumbeat that had guided their dance. The feast, with its roasted goat and sweet fruits, was not the point of the celebration. It was the fuel for it. The shared meal was the kindling that had lit the fire of this communal joy. The food, sacrificed and prepared with love, had filled their stomachs, but it had done something far more important. It had gathered them, physically and spiritually, into one place. It had broken down the invisible walls between individual households, creating a single shared experience. The act of eating from the same platters, of tasting the same sacrificial meat, of breaking the same bread, had forged a temporary but powerful bond, a common ground of satisfaction and gratitude from which laughter, dance, and storytelling could naturally spring. The memories being created this night, the feel of his hand in the elders, the sound of the flute, the sight of the bride's smile as she listened to the stories, were all anchored in the shared sustenance of the feast. The meal was the solid, tangible foundation upon which the invisible, enduring architecture of memory was built. It strengthened the bonds of community, not by proclamation, but by the simple, sacred act of sharing bread and meat, transforming a collection of individuals into a family, and a simple gathering into a memory that would be told and retold long after the last crumb had vanished and the final note of music had faded into the starry night. Chapter 15, a time of drought. The sky over Nazareth was a relentless, polished brass, bleached of cloud and mercy. The sun, which had once been a source of life and growth, had become a tyrant, its gaze searing the land day after parched day. The gentle rains of spring had never arrived, and the earth, starved and cracked, opened its mouth in 1,000 thirsty fissures. The vibrant green of the barley fields had long since withered to a brittle, dusty gold, the stalks standing like the brittle bones of a forgotten promise. The village itself seemed to shrink under the weight of the heat, its usual sound muted, the air thick and still, carrying only the scent of dust and despair. The joyful memory of the wedding feast felt like a story from another lifetime, a dream of abundance taunting them in this waking time of want. Inside their home, the atmosphere was one of hushed conservation. The cheerful clatter of mealtime was gone, replaced by a somber, deliberate silence. David watched his mother, Sarah, move to the large storage jars that stood against the coolest wall. Her movements were slow, reverent, as she lifted the heavy stone lids. He saw her shoulders slump almost imperceptibly as she looked inside, assessing the dwindling treasures within. From one jar, she scooped out a careful, measured portion of grain, the kernels rattling hollowly in the clay bowl, a sound that spoke of limits and an uncertain future. From another, she took a handful of dried figs, their once plump bodies now shrunken and hard, precious nuggets of concentrated sweetness, saved for a time of need. That time was now. The meal she prepared was a ghost of their usual fare. The flatbread was thinner, made with less flour, and it lacked the soft, puffed life of better days. The figs were not a side dish, but the main sustenance, their chewy, sugary flesh a stark contrast to the meager bread. When the family gathered, there was no lively conversation, no sharing of stories. They ate in a silence punctuated only by the dry shuffling sound of the wind outside, a constant reminder of the thirst that gripped the land. David chewed his small portion slowly, making it last, the sweet fig a fleeting comfort against the bitter taste of anxiety that coated his tongue. He saw the worry etched in the new lines around his father's eyes, the way his mother's hands lingered over the empty storage jars after the meal. The fear was a palpable presence in the room, a third unwelcome guest at their sparse table. Yet, in the midst of the scarcity, something else began to take root, a quiet lesson taking shape in the cracked earth of David's understanding. He watched his parents expecting to see panic, but instead he saw a grim, steadfast resolve. There was no hoarding, no turning inward. When old Miriam from next door, her own supplies exhausted, appeared at their gate with eyes full of silent shame, Sarah did not hesitate. She broke David's own piece of bread in half and gave it to her, along with 2 of their precious figs. The act was done without fanfare, a simple, unthinking outflow of a faith that trusted in provision beyond the visible jars. Jacob, after a long day of searching for work where there was none to be found, would still gather them for the evening prayer. His voice, though roughened by dust and worry, did not waver. He did not pray for an immediate end to the drought, but for strength, for resilience, and for the faith to trust in God's timing, even when the heavens were like iron and the earth like brass. David listened to those prayers, and he watched the shared figs and the halved bread. He felt the fear, yes, the gnawing emptiness in his belly that was more than hunger, but he also felt the solid, unshakable foundation of his parents' faith. They were not denying the hardship. They were facing it with a spirit forged in something tougher than circumstance. The drought was teaching him that resilience was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act with generosity in spite of it. Trusting God did not mean expecting the rains to return the moment you prayed. It meant sharing your last fig with your neighbor, believing that somehow, in a way you could not see, God would honor that sacrifice and provide. The hard times were not a sign of God's absence, but a furnace where a deeper, more enduring faith was tempered. As he finished his small meal, the sweetness of the fig was joined by a new, sober taste on his palate, the taste of a trust that was being learned not in the easy abundance of harvest, but in the stark, cracked reality of drought. Chapter 16. Helping a Neighbor. The news traveled through the parched village not with shouts, but with the quiet, worried murmurs that were the currency of hard times. Old Reuben, the potter whose hands had shaped the very jars that held their dwindling grain, had fallen ill. In a season where every breath of energy was precious, his weakness was a vulnerability that threatened not just his own small household, but the delicate balance of care that held the community together. The drought had already stretched their resources thin as parchment, but this new trouble called for a different kind of sustenance, one that fed not just the body, but the spirit of collective endurance. In David's home, the decision was made without a single word of debate. Sarah went to the storage jars, her movements even more deliberate and reverent than before. She took a larger portion of their precious grain, the sound of it scraping the bottom of the jar, a sobering whisper in the quiet room. She ground it herself, the millstone's rumble a solemn prayer, and mixed it with water to make a thick, hearty dough for bread. Into a small lidded cooking pot she poured water and added a careful handful of lentils, the last of their store, along with a pinch of precious salt and a few sprigs of wild thyme she had managed to find clinging to life in a shaded crack of the hillside. She was not preparing a meal for her own family. She was crafting a vessel of compassion, a tangible expression of their faith that in giving they would not be diminished. When the simple meal was ready, a round of flat bread still warm from the stone, and the small pot of thin, fragrant broth, Sarah placed them in a woven basket and turned to David. Her eyes were serious, but they held a soft light of purpose. She handed him the basket, its weight a profound responsibility in his small hands. This was not a chore like fetching water. This was a mission. He was to be the bearer of their family's care, the legs that would carry their shared strength to a neighbor in need. He took the basket, holding it carefully against his chest, the warmth of the bread seeping through the woven reeds, a small, comforting heat against the pervasive anxiety of the drought. The walk to Reuben's house was short, but it felt long under the oppressive brassy sky. The usual friendly greetings from doorways were absent. The village seemed to be holding its breath. David pushed open the low gate to Reuben's courtyard and saw the old man lying on a mat in the shade, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. Reuben's wife, Judith, emerged from the dim interior of the house, her own face etched with fatigue and worry. When she saw David standing there with the basket, Her stern expression crumpled, and for a moment her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She did not speak, but her hands, rough from work, reached out and took the basket from him as if it were made of the finest glass. She knelt beside her husband, broke a piece of the soft, warm bread, and dipped it into the broth, holding it to his lips. Reuben's eyes fluttered open, and he accepted the morsel, his movements slow and weak. As he ate, a faint trace of color seemed to return to his cheeks, a small but undeniable victory against the illness that held him. Judith looked up at David, who still stood silently by the gate, and gave him a slow, grateful nod. It was a look that held more meaning than 1,000 words. It spoke of relief, of a burden shared, of the simple, profound knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle. David walked home, the empty basket swinging lightly at his side. The sky was still a relentless blue, the earth still cracked and thirsty, but something had shifted inside him. He had seen it with his own eyes, the way a simple pot of broth and a round of bread could become more than just food. In that sparse offering, he had witnessed compassion made visible. It was a quiet defiance against the despair of the drought, a declaration that even when resources were scarce, kindness did not have to be. The meal was a thread, thin but strong, stitching their families well to Reuben's sickness, their strength to his weakness. He understood now that the community was not just a collection of houses, but a living body, and when one part suffered, the others rallied to bring nourishment, to share the load. The true support of the community was not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet, consistent offering of bread and broth, delivered by a boy with a heavy basket and a heart learning the deepest meaning of shared sustenance. Chapter 17. The Prophet's Visit. A ripple of something more than curiosity moved through the drought-stricken village, a current of hushed awe and nervous anticipation. A prophet, a man known for his searing words and his unshakable connection to the divine, had come to Nazareth. He was not a king or a warrior, but a man of the wilderness, his cloak simple, his eyes holding the fire of one who had conversed with God in the solitude of the desert. He moved through the dusty streets not with a herald, but with a quiet gravity that commanded respect and stilled the usual chatter. When he paused at the gate of David's home, it felt less like a chance occurrence and more like a destined arrival, a divine appointment in the midst of their hardship. Jacob, his face still lined with the worry of the failing crops, did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his posture one of deep reverence, and welcomed the man inside as if he were an angel of the Lord. The prophet's presence seemed to alter the very air in their small home, charging it with a spiritual electricity. Sarah, with a quiet fervor that pushed aside her own anxiety, moved to prepare a meal. It was a humble offering born of scarcity, the last of their good flour made into a thin flat bread, a small bowl of olives from a jar saved for such a time, a few dried figs, and a cup of water. Yet as she prepared it, her movements were filled with a sacred purpose. This was not just food for a traveler. It was an offering laid upon the altar of a holy moment. They gathered around the low table, the prophet seated in the place of honor. The meal began not with the usual familial chatter, but with a profound silence that the prophet himself seemed to carry with him. He looked at the simple food, then at their expectant, weary faces, and a gentle smile softened the severity of his features. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of royal blessing, but of shared humanity, and began to speak. His voice was not the thunder they might have expected, but a low, resonant stream, clear and cool like water from a deep well. He did not speak of the drought, of politics, or of impending doom. He spoke of love. He described God's love not as a distant, abstract concept, but as a fierce, intimate, and unwavering presence, as close as their own breath, as constant as the sun behind the brassy sky. It was a love that saw their struggle, that felt the ache in their empty stomachs, and that had not abandoned them. As he spoke, he broke a piece of the flatbread, holding it up. He used it as a parable, his words weaving a tapestry of spiritual truth around their simple meal. The bread, he said, was like their daily lives. It could be made with pure ingredients, handled with clean hands and a clean heart, and it would nourish the soul as well as the body. Or it could be tainted by greed, jealousy, or faithlessness, and it would bring no true satisfaction. Purity, he taught them, was not just a matter of ritual washings or following the law to the letter. It was the state of the heart at every moment, while grinding grain, while sharing water, while welcoming a stranger, while enduring a drought. It was offering every action, no matter how small, to God with a spirit of love and trust. A pure heart made every meal a sacrament, every chore a prayer, and every hardship a path to deeper faith. David listened, his own piece of bread forgotten in his hand. He watched the prophet's face, illuminated by the soft light filtering through the window, and felt the man's words bypass his ears and settle directly into his spirit. They were like a key turning in a locked door inside him. The prophet's teaching about God's intimate love washed away the lingering fear the drought had planted in his heart. The lesson on purity gave a new, profound meaning to the grinding stone, the water jar, the simple act of breaking bread. He saw his own life, his family's struggles, reflected in the prophet's words, and they were suddenly illuminated with a holy significance. The hunger in his belly was real, but the hunger the prophet spoke of, a hunger for righteousness, for a pure heart, felt even more urgent. When the prophet finished speaking and they ate the rest of the meal in a comfortable, awed silence, a new kind of warmth filled David, different from the warmth of full stomachs in times of plenty. It was the warmth of inspiration, a fire kindled by the prophet's words. He looked at his parents and saw a new light in their eyes, a refreshed resolve that had nothing to do with the weather or the state of their storage jars. The prophet had not brought rain, but he had brought something perhaps more vital in that moment: perspective. He had reframed their world, showing them that even in the dust and deprivation, they could live in the radiant, all-encompassing love of God, and that a life of purity, lived one simple, faithful action at a time, was the truest form of worship. As the prophet finally rose to leave, bestowing a quiet blessing upon their home, David felt not the end of a visit, but the beginning of a new understanding. The prophet's words would linger long after his departure, a well of inspiration from which he would draw for the rest of his life, transforming the mundane into the sacred, and a boy's simple faith into a soul-deep conviction. Chapter 18. Learning Ritual Purity. The prophet's words had settled in their home like a fine, sanctifying dust, altering the very quality of the light and the texture of the silence. In the days that followed his visit, David found his gaze lingering on the ordinary objects of his life: the water jar, the grinding stone, the simple clay bowl from which he ate. They seemed to hum with a new potential, charged with the prophet's teaching that purity was not a distant state for priests and holy days, but a condition of the heart to be cultivated in every moment, with every action. It was his mother, Sarah, who saw the question forming in his eyes, and who, with her quiet, practical wisdom, began to show him how this lofty concept could be woven into the very fabric of their daily sustenance. The lesson came not with a lecture, but with an invitation. As she began to prepare their modest midday meal of flatbread and olives, she turned to David, her expression serene. She brought forth a beautiful, long-spouted brass ewer, a family heirloom used only for ritual purposes, and a wide matching basin. She filled the ewer with fresh, cool water from the jar he had fetched that morning, and placed the basin on the low table before him. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a silent dance of preparation. She then held her own hands over the basin, and with a voice as clear and gentle as the water itself, she explained that this was not merely about washing away the physical dirt of the morning's chores. This was Netalat Yadayim, the lifting of the hands, a ritual that prepared them not just to eat, but to receive. She poured the water first over her right hand, then her left, letting it cascade from her wrists to her fingertips, a liquid cleansing that was as much a prayer as it was a physical act. She explained that the table where they shared their food was to be considered like the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. Just as the priests would wash and purify themselves before offering sacrifices to God, so too did they wash before partaking of the food God had provided. It was a sign of respect, a physical acknowledgement that the meal they were about to eat was a gift, a holy trust. The simple act of washing became a threshold, a conscious step from the mundane world of work and worry into the sacred space of gratitude and communion. David mimicked her, holding his own small work-roughened hands over the basin. The water was cool and shocking, a vivid sensation that pulled his attention fully into the present moment. As Sarah poured, he watched the water sluice over his skin, carrying with it the invisible dust of the courtyard, the grime from the olive basket, the lingering fatigue of the drought. But he felt it washing away more than that. It felt like a cleansing of intention, a symbolic rinsing of any resentment or anxiety he carried, preparing a clean vessel for the blessing to come. The ritual was a pause, a deliberate interruption of routine that forced a moment of reflection before the satisfaction of hunger. As they ate their meal, Sarah, seizing the teachable moment, spoke of other purity customs that wove holiness into their lives. She described the careful separation of meat and dairy, a practice that reminded them of the life given for their sustenance and the sanctity of that sacrifice. She talked about the laws of the Sabbath, how setting apart one day for rest, and God made the entire week more holy. She explained that these rituals were not burdensome restrictions, but loving guidelines from a father to his children, designed to elevate their every action, to remind them at every turn that they were a people set apart for a purpose. Each custom was a thread, and when woven together, they created a tapestry of a life lived in constant conscious relationship with the divine. David listened, chewing his bread, slowly, the flavor seeming richer, more complex. He looked at his clean hands, at the simple food on the table, and at his mother's calm, faithful face. The prophet's abstract teaching about purity suddenly crystallized into a tangible, beautiful reality. He understood now that the rituals were not empty gestures. They were the architecture of holiness, the tools his people used to build a sacred space around the most ordinary acts of life. Washing his hands before a meal was not just about hygiene, it was an act of consecration. It declared that this bread, this olive, this water was more than mere fuel. It was a gift from God, and they, by preparing their hearts and hands to receive it, were participating in a holy exchange. The meal itself was transformed from a simple appeasement of hunger into a sacred ritual, a daily reenactment of their covenant, a tangible way to make the mundane magnificent and to find the divine in the breaking of bread. Chapter 19. A Journey to Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem was a river of dust and devotion, a winding path worn smooth by the sandals of countless generations of pilgrims. For David, leaving the familiar boundaries of Nazareth was like stepping into a vast, breathing storybook. The small, contained world of his village, the well, the fields, the synagogue, fell away, replaced by an unfolding landscape of rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and valleys dotted with gnarled olive trees. The air itself felt different, charged with a collective purpose that was as tangible as the sun on his skin. He walked beside his father, Jacob, his mother Sarah, just ahead, their steps falling into the steady, enduring rhythm of the journey. All around them, a river of people flowed in the same direction. Families from Galilee, their accents a lilting music, groups of men debating scripture with animated gestures, women singing quiet psalms that rose and fell with the path. They were no longer just individuals or separate families. They were a people, a single body moving with one heart toward the beating center of their faith. Their meals on the road were acts of simplicity and profound fellowship. At midday, when the sun was high and the dust hung in a golden haze around him, they would find a patch of shade under a terebinth tree or a rocky overhang. Sarah would unwrap a cloth bundle containing their travel food, rounds of hard, durable flatbread, and a block of salty white cheese made from the milk of their one remaining goat. There was no stew, no fresh fruit, no relish of olives. It was sustenance in its most basic form, fuel for the body on a journey of the spirit. But as they ate, breaking the tough bread with their hands and sharing the crumbly cheese, others would join them in the shade. A family from Cana would offer a handful of dates. A widow traveling with her brothers would share a skin of tart, watered wine. No one kept their provisions to themselves. The bread and cheese from Nazareth mingled with the dates from Cana and the wine from an unknown village, creating a spontaneous communal feast. There were no formal invitations, only the unspoken law of the road, the understanding that on this journey all were neighbors, all were family, bound by a shared destination and a shared hunger. David watched these exchanges, the simple sharing of meager travel rations, and felt a unity that was different from the close-knit bonds of his village. This was a unity of purpose, a fellowship forged not by years of proximity, but by a common longing for the holy city. He saw faces etched with the weariness of long miles, but also alight with a fervent hope. He listened to the snatches of conversation, discussions of prophecies, recollections of festivals past, prayers murmured for a safe arrival. The shared bread was the glue of this temporary community. It was a silent promise that they were in this together, that the thirst of one was the thirst of all, that the hunger of another was a call to break one's own loaf in half. As the days passed and the landscape began to change, rising toward the Judean hills, a new energy began to crackle through the pilgrim throng. The conversations grew more animated, the psalms were sung with more conviction, and then, cresting a final long ridge, they saw it. Jerusalem, the city of David, Zion, the dwelling place of God. It rose from the stony hills, its walls glowing like warm honey in the afternoon light. The magnificent temple complex, a dazzling white and gold crown at its heart. A great, wordless cry seemed to rise from the thousands of throats around him, a gasp of awe, a sob of joy, a shouted prayer. The sight struck David with a physical force, stealing his breath and filling his eyes with sudden, unbidden tears. The endless walking, the dust, the simple meals, the weariness, it all fell away, rendered insignificant by the glory of the destination. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his hand still clutching a crust of the journey's bread. He looked from the holy city, shimmering in the distance, to the faces of the pilgrims around him, faces streaked with dust and tears, all turned toward Zion with identical expressions of rapturous devotion. In that moment, he felt it completely, the truth he had been sensing all along the road. The unity of the people was not an abstract idea. It was a living, breathing reality. It was in the shared dust on their feet, the shared psalms on their lips, and the shared bread in their hands. They were one body with one heart, ascending to the house of the one God. The journey, with all its hardships and its simple, shared meals, had not just been a means to an end. It had been a purification, a weaving of individual threads into a sacred tapestry. And as he took the final steps toward the glorious gates, David knew that the memory of this journey, the taste of hard bread and shared cheese on the road to Jerusalem, would be a part of his faith forever, a humble, human prelude to the divine majesty that awaited. Chapter 20. The Passover preparation, the very stones of Jerusalem, seemed to whisper of ancient stories, of liberation and divine promise. As David's family settled into their temporary lodging for the festival, the small rented room was cramped and smelled of old plaster and the dust of countless pilgrims. But it was transformed by a sense of urgent, sacred purpose. The joyous chaos of the city, teeming with families from every corner of Judea and Galilee, was a world away from the quiet rhythms of Nazareth. Here, every action, every breath, was oriented toward the coming night, the night of Passover, and the air crackled with the collective reverent anticipation. The journey was over, but the real work was just beginning. The first task was the cleansing. It was not the simple sweeping of their Nazareth home. This was a ritual purification, a meticulous hunt for any trace of leaven, any remnant of shemetz. Sarah, her face set in lines of solemn concentration, took a feather and a small wooden spoon. With David and his father assisting, they moved through every corner of the small room. They swept into cracks in the floor, brushed along the rough-hewn ledges of the single window, and turned out their travel bags, ensuring not a single crumb of the leavened bread from their journey remained. David watched a tiny forgotten crust, a relic of their travel rations, be carefully swept onto the spoon and set aside to be burned. The act felt profoundly significant. They were not just cleaning a room. They were preparing a holy vessel, creating a space utterly free from the old, the puffed up, the symbol of slavery and haste, making room for the new, the pure, the flat bread of freedom. Next came the making of the matzah, the unleavened bread. There was no time for the dough to rest, to rise, to become proud. In a corner of the room, Sarah mixed flour and water, her hands moving with a swift, almost frantic energy that mirrored the story they were preparing to tell. She kneaded the simple mixture and immediately began to roll it out, pressing it thin and piercing it with a grooved rolling pin to prevent any air pockets from forming. David's job was to watch the fire, to ensure the baking stones were searingly hot. The flat discs of dough were slapped onto the stones, where they baked in a matter of moments, emerging flat, crisp, and pale, bearing the marks of their haste. The air filled with the plain, toasted scent of the matzah, a smell of urgency and obedience, a stark contrast to the rich, yeasty aroma of their daily bread. This bread was not about flavor or satisfaction. It was about memory, a tangible reenactment of their ancestors' flight from Egypt, who had no time to let their bread rise. Alongside the matzah, Sarah prepared the maror, the bitter herbs. She took fresh, sharp horseradish and bitter greens, crushing them in a stone mortar. The pungent, eye-watering scent filled the small room, a harsh and unpleasant aroma that made David's nose wrinkle. She explained, her voice soft but firm, that this was the taste of slavery. This was the flavor of oppression, of tears, of the unbearable bitterness the Israelites had endured for generations in Egypt. It was not meant to be pleasant. It was meant to be remembered, to be felt on the tongue and in the heart, a visceral connection to the suffering that made their freedom so precious. As David helped, grinding the herbs and stacking the flat, brittle sheets of matzah, his father Jacob began to weave the story for him. He spoke in a low, reverent tone, his words painting a picture not of abstract history, but of a shared, familial past. He described the brick-making under the scorching sun, the crack of the taskmaster's whip, the desperate cries of a people with no hope. He spoke of Moses, of the plagues, of the terrifying night of the final plague, and of the blood on the doorposts that meant salvation. And then, his voice swelling with a passion David had seldom heard, he described the moment of escape, the hurried, fearful packing, the unleavened dough wrapped in cloaks, the great, rushing exodus from the house of bondage into the vast, unknown desert, and ultimately into the arms of God and the promise of freedom. David listened, his hand stilling, the bitter scent of the herbs in his nostrils, and the taste of dust from the matzah on the air. He looked at the flat, pierced bread, the symbol of their haste, and the crushed, bitter herbs, the symbol of their pain. He was no longer just a boy helping his mother prepare a meal. He was a link in an unbreakable chain, participating in a drama that was both ancient and eternally new. The cleaning, the baking, the crushing, it was all part of the story. The story was not just something to be told, it was something to be eaten, to be tasted, to be lived. In that crowded Jerusalem room, surrounded by the tangible elements of the Passover, David understood that freedom was not an abstract concept. It was a story baked into flat bread, a memory ground into bitter herbs, a legacy of a night when death passed over and a people, his people, were born into a covenant of liberation, a story he was now helping to prepare so that he too could taste and remember and be free. Chapter 21. The Passover Seder. The final sliver of sun vanished behind the Judean hills, and a profound, expectant hush descended upon Jerusalem, a city holding its breath on the threshold of memory. Inside the cramped, lamp-lit room, the air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb, bitter herbs, and the dusty, toasted aroma of the matzah. The small, low table was set not for a meal, but for a reenactment, its elements arranged like sacred props upon a holy stage. The festive cup of wine, the plate of bitter herbs, the bowl of salt water, the charosé, a paste of fruit and nuts resembling the mortar of slavery, and the stack of flat, unleathered bread. David sat between his father and mother, his heart beating a rhythm that felt both ancient and new, the weight of the coming hours settling upon his small shoulders like a mantle passed down through time. Jacob, his face solemn and illuminated by the flickering lamp, lifted the first cup of wine. His voice, usually the familiar sound of daily instruction and comfort, now took on the cadence of 1,000 generations, a resonant chant that filled the small room. He recited the Kiddush, the blessing that sanctified the night, setting it apart from all other nights, declaring it a night of watchfulness, of remembrance, of divine appointment. The words were a gateway, swinging open on hinges of faith to usher them into the heart of the story. Then the ritual began in earnest. Jacob took a sprig of fresh parsley, dipped it into the bowl of salt water, and passed it to each of them. David placed it in his mouth, the crisp greenness of the parsley instantly assaulted by the sharp, stinging brine of the salt water. It was the taste of spring, of new life baptized in the tears of slavery, a paradoxical flavor of hope born from suffering. Next came the breaking of the middle matzah. Jacob took one of the flat, brittle sheets and broke it in two with a sound that cracked through the silence like a whip. He wrapped the larger piece in a cloth and set it aside, a mysterious custom David knew was called the afikoman, to be searched for and redeemed later. The broken bread was a symbol of their fractured state in Egypt, of a people broken by oppression, their wholeness yet to be restored. Then the storytelling began. Jacob, no longer just a father, but now the sage of his household, leaned forward, his eyes capturing the light. He did not merely recite the story of the Exodus. He invoked it. "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt," he began, his voice dropping to a whisper that demanded absolute attention. He painted a picture, not of a distant mythical past, but of their own family's history. He spoke of their ancestors' backs aching under the weight of sun-baked bricks, of the hopelessness that was a heavier burden than any pyramid stone, of the taste of dust and despair that was their daily bread. As he spoke, he gestured to the elements on the table, making the story tangible. He pointed to the marrow, the bitter herbs. It was time. Sarah prepared a small portion for each of them, placing a pungent heap of the crushed horseradish and bitter greens onto a piece of matzah. David took his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at the pale green paste, its sharp, acrid scent already stinging his nostrils. He placed it in his mouth and chewed. The bitterness was immediate and overwhelming. It was not like the pleasant bitterness of an olive or the sharpness of a turnip. This was a different quality altogether, a harsh, aggressive bitterness that clawed at his tongue and the roof of his mouth, releasing a chemical heat that shot straight up into his sinuses, making his eyes water instantly. It was an assault on the senses, a flavor of pure, unadulterated pain. He coughed, tears now streaming freely down his cheeks, not from sadness, but from the physical, visceral shock of the taste. In that moment, the story his father was telling ceased to be a story. The words, bitter lives, hard labor, cruel bondage, were no longer just words. They had a flavor. They had a sensation, the ache in his jaw from chewing, the fire in his nose, the tears blurring his vision. This was the sorrow of slavery. This was what it felt like to have no hope, to have your life crushed into a paste of suffering. He understood, in a way he never could, from words alone, the profound, gut-wrenching bitterness of being owned, of being nothing. The taste was a dark, shocking revelation, a direct line to the agony of his ancestors, and as he finally swallowed, the harshness lingering in his throat, he knew he would never forget this lesson. It was a sorrow tasted, a memory seared not just upon his mind, but upon his very senses, a foundational bitterness against which the sweet taste of freedom, yet to come, would shine with unimaginable brilliance. The sharp, cleansing fire of the bitter herbs still burned on David's tongue, a visceral echo of the slavery his people had endured, but as the ritual unfolded, the atmosphere in the lamplit room began to shift. The focus turned from the taste of bondage to the promise of deliverance. Jacob's voice, which had been a low, sorrowful whisper describing the bitterness of Egypt, now began to rise, gathering strength and momentum like a river breaking free from a dam. He recounted the 10 plagues not as a distant myth, but as a dramatic, divine intervention, and with the mention of each one, blood, frogs, darkness, the death of the firstborn, David, along with everyone at the table, dipped a finger into their cup of wine and let a drop fall onto their plate. It was a solemn physical act of diminishing their own joy and solidarity with the suffering of the Egyptians. A poignant reminder that liberation, while glorious, was never without a cost. Then came the heart of the Seder, the singing of the Hallel, the great psalms of praise. Jacob began the first line, his voice tentative at first, but then Sarah joined in, her softer melody weaving with his, and soon the small room was filled with the powerful rising cadence of the ancient songs of thanksgiving. They sang of the night of watching, of the outstretched arm of God, of the sea parting and the enemy drowning. David knew the words, had mumbled them in previous years, but tonight, with the taste of slavery still sharp in his memory and the story of liberation ringing in his ears, he sang with a full heart. The melodies were no longer just tunes. They were the very sound of freedom, a collective voice of a people remembering the moment they were forged into a nation. The songs swelled, filling the cramped space, spilling out the window to join the chorus of 1,000 other seders happening throughout Jerusalem. A citywide symphony of gratitude that made the very stones seem to vibrate with joy. As the final notes of the Hallel faded into a reverent silence, the mood shifted once more from the epic to the intimate, from the past to the present. It was time for the meal. The roasted lamb, the symbol of the Paschal sacrifice, was brought forth. Its rich, savory aroma, so different from the stark scents of matzah and maror, filled the room with a promise of fulfillment. Alongside it came the charissé, the sweet, sticky paste of fruits, nuts, and wine. Sarah showed David how to make a Hillel sandwich, placing a piece of the bitter herb alongside the sweet charosé between two pieces of the flat matzah. He took a bite. The harshness of the maror was immediately tempered, transformed by the cloying, fruity sweetness of the charosé. The two opposing flavors wrestled on his palate, the memory of suffering and the taste of God's deliverance, the mortar of slavery and the promise of the promised land, all held together by the bread of affliction. It was a taste of profound complexity, a culinary metaphor for their entire history. Joy and sorrow, bondage and freedom, inextricably linked. They ate the full meal then, the lamb tender and flavorful, the matzah providing a simple, sturdy base. But as David ate, he realized the food was more than just nourishment. Each element was a thread in a living tapestry. The matzah was the haste of their flight, the maror the pain of their oppression, the charosé the hope that sweetened their labor, the lamb the protection of God's covenant. This meal was not a passive remembrance, it was an active participation. With every bite, he was tasting the story, digesting the memory, making the journey from Egypt to freedom a part of his own flesh and blood. He looked around the table at his parents' faces, radiant in the lamplight, and felt a connection that spanned centuries. He was not just David of Nazareth. He was a child of the Exodus, a member of a people chosen and delivered. After the meal, the hidden piece of matzah, the afikoman, was found and redeemed, a final, playful symbol of redemption that brought a smile to everyone's face. Then, with cups refilled for the third and fourth time, the singing began again, this time more joyful, more raucous, filled with traditional folk songs and playful melodies about the wonders of the night. The room, once a stage for solemn ritual, now buzzed with a liberated, infectious joy. David clapped his hands, his voice joining the others, his heart feeling impossibly light and full. This was the joy of liberation, not just a historical event, but a living, breathing reality renewed each year around this table. This meal was their identity, their faith, and their freedom, all served on a platter, tasted on the tongue, and sung from the heart. It was the story of who they were. And as the night deepened and the songs continued, David understood that as long as they kept this Seder, as long as they broke this matzah and tasted these bitter herbs, they would never truly be slaves again. Their faith and their people would endure, renewed and strengthened, meal by sacred meal, year by everlasting year. Chapter 22. Home again. The road back to Nazareth was a path of quiet reflection, each step carrying David further from the holy tumult of Jerusalem and deeper into the familiar embrace of home. The city's echoes, the triumphant psalms, the bleating of lambs in the temple court, the collective gasp of awe at the sight of the sacred walls, faded slowly, replaced by the gentle sounds of the Galilean countryside, the whisper of wind through olive groves, the distant call of a shepherd to his flock, the crunch of his own sandals on the sun-warmed dust. The journey felt different from the one toward Jerusalem. It was not a pilgrimage of anticipation, but a return of integration, a time to sift the wonders he had witnessed and fold them into the fabric of his everyday life. As he crossed the threshold of his family's simple stone house, the stillness was a palpable presence. The room, so small and ordinary after the grandeur of Jerusalem, felt like a sanctuary. The familiar scent of dried herbs, sun-warmed clay, and the faint, ever-present odor of the oil lamp welcomed him like an old friend. He set down his travel bundle, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of the room, the grinding stone in the corner, the hearth blackened by countless fires, the low table where they shared every meal. It was all the same, and yet nothing was. He saw it now through a lens polished by the Passover Seder, each object shimmering with a significance he had only vaguely sensed before. In the quiet days that followed, David found his mind returning again and again to the meals, not just the magnificent ritualized feast of the Seder, but all of them. He saw a vast, unbroken tapestry woven from countless shared moments around a table. He remembered the warmth of the flatbread in his hands on his very first morning, the lesson in gratitude whispered by his mother over a simple bowl of olives. He felt again the ache in his arms from grinding grain and the profound pride of seeing his family eat the bread he had helped to make. The boisterous joy of his cousin's visit, the solemn peace of the Sabbath, the sacrificial offering of the goat for the wedding, the bitter herbs of slavery, the sweet charisse of deliverance, each taste, each scent was a thread in this grand design. He understood now with a clarity that settled deep in his bones that food was never merely nourishment. It was a language, the first and most fundamental language of love and community. It was the way his mother poured her care into kneading dough, the way his father's blessing transformed a humble stew into a testament of faith. It was the bridge they built to a dusty stranger at their gate, the net that caught stories from distant deserts and seas. It was the shared strength in a pot of broth delivered to a sick neighbor, the collective joy in a wedding feast, the unified hope of pilgrims breaking bread on the road to Zion. Every meal was an act of bonding, with family, with community, and most profoundly with God. Carrying water from the well one morning, he watched his mother begin the day's baking, her hands performing the ancient dance of flour and water. He saw in her movements the same rhythm as the women in Jerusalem preparing the matzah, the same purpose as Sarah teaching Leah in a story from long ago. He realized he was part of a chain, a living tradition that stretched back through the generations, past the Exodus to the very dawn of their people. The recipes were not written on scrolls, but in the muscle memory of hands that kneaded, in the stories told over simmering pots, in the prayers whispered over broken bread. These traditions were not static relics. They were a river flowing from the past through him and into the future. The food was the vessel, carrying forward the faith, the values, the very identity of his people. It was how they remembered who they were and to whom they belonged. As he placed the water jar beside his mother and received her smile, David knew that his true home was not just this stone house in Nazareth, but here in this sacred, continuous act, the simple, profound, and everlasting bond of breaking bread together.